It is so wonderful to see this room filled almost to capacity. If you're having any trouble finding a seat or want to just come closer, there's still a few spots up front. My name is Bill Donahue, and I'm the director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies in the Keough School of Global Affairs here at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm here with our Dean, Scott Appleby, to welcome you all and to welcome the ambassador. Before we get down to the talk, though, just a few words. I wanted to let you know, to begin with, that it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the 2019 Nanovic Forum, which is a special event even by our standards, and we do a lot of these. Virtually all of what we do, but this forum in particular, is made possible by the generosity of Bob and Liz Nanovic, who recognized some 25 years ago that Europe and European studies would need to remain a priority for students and scholars in order for this university to become truly great. So we might pause to reflect not only on their magnanimity, but also on their foresight. Because a quarter century ago, Europe, or at least Western Europe, appeared to many observers to be a rather settled matter, an indisputable success story whose popularity was demonstrated by the fact that virtually every Soviet successor state in Eastern Europe, not to mention Turkey, was knocking on its door, urgently seeking membership in an august group that had done so much to advance post-war peace and prosperity. So Bob and Liz were right to intuit that Europe would remain vital, even if none of us could have quite predicted the turmoil that Europe finds itself in today. The title of today's talk is noteworthy. The United States and Europe, friends and allies or rivals? This is the ambassador's title. Who would have thought that to be a serious question just several years ago? Who would have expected that an organization that the United States consistently encouraged and fostered through much of the post-war period would be deemed a foe or enemy by the President of the United States of America? Back in the day, if one spoke of rivalry at all, it was not expressed in such terms, but would have at most referred to fairly minor economic competition having to do perhaps with agricultural subsidies, reflecting the important fact that the EU over the years has become a free trade zone fully on parity with the US market. But times have changed, and the Europe some of us had become complacent about is now riven by internal division, as well as by strife between it and the United States. Now, all I have to do is set up the problem. The solution will be addressed by the ambassador. To explain all this, or at least a great deal of it, some of it, we could have no one more expert and truly better poised than tonight's speaker, Ambassador David OSullivan. It is really no wonder that he was named European of the Year by European Movement Ireland, because he has, throughout his 40-year career, served Europe and the EU in numerous high-level capacities. In 1999, he served the European Commission as Director General of Education and Culture. From 2005 to 2010, as Director General of Trade. And in 2010, he added external relations to his portfolio. You will have noticed I skipped 5 years. Well, those were very big ones. He is widely respected for his intervening work from 2000 to 2005 as Secretary General of the European Commission. After a stint as Chief Operating Officer of the European External Action Service from 2010 to 2014, OSullivan served as Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, concluding his term just last March. In an interview that he gave at the end of his time in office, Ambassador OSullivan referred poignantly, I think, to the, quote, shared destiny between the United States and Europe, and specifically the European Union. That is something, he said, that we have had historically through ties of family and kinship, through the shared experience of 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the rebuilding of Europe through the Marshall Plan, and the strong alliance we had during the Cold War, end quote. It is indeed, I think, this deeply felt felt shared destiny between the United States and Europe, that Bob and Liz Nanovic, through their extraordinary generosity, have enabled us here at Notre Dame to explore, to research, and to promote. I am grateful to them and to you, Ambassador, for making this evening possible. So please join me in welcoming our 2019 Nanovic Forum speaker, David OSullivan.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for those very warm words of welcome. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am extraordinarily grateful to the Nanovic Institute for this invitation and for your hospitality. I'd like to thank you, Bill, for your introduction. I'd like to pay a particular mention, if I may, to Monica Caro for all the help she's given me in organizing a wonderful program. And I could not have asked for a better opportunity, and I hope we'll have a good discussion here this evening. I've been told I can talk for some 40 to 50 minutes. I'll try and make it a bit shorter. I'd like these things to be interactive, and I'd like to leave the maximum amount of time for questions and answers. But I am very grateful to have this opportunity for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm always delighted to have any excuse to come back to the United States. I first came here in 1961 when I was 8 years of age. My father was in the Irish military serving with the United Nations in the Congo, and my mother, whose family had all moved to California, decided we would spend a year in California. So I moved to Pasadena, coming from Dublin in 1961, and Professor Declan Kybert, of course, a good friend of mine and colleague from Trinity College, will know what I speak of. Dublin 1961 to Pasadena was a bit like what I describe as my Wizard of Oz moment, coming, you know, that moment when the movie turns from black and white to color. And I fell in love with this great country then, and have been coming backwards with great pleasure, regularly backwards and forwards ever since. Secondly, because it gives me the opportunity to visit Indiana, and I'm ashamed to say this is actually I've visited 44 American states. I haven't quite got the full 50, and Indiana was on my box of the five more to fulfill, so now I'm down to 45 states, so thank you for that. And finally, giving me the opportunity to come to Notre Dame, which of course is world-renowned, and particularly the Irish connection, so I'm extraordinarily apologetic about the fact that I've never come here before, and I'm very glad also to be able to fill that gap in my experience and my knowledge. What a wonderful campus you have here. I walked around the lake this morning, and beautiful campus, and also the great work you do in promoting relations, particularly between Ireland and the United States, which of course is very much appreciated. As Bill started to say, I mean, the title for tonight's talk is some of the tensions or some of the difficulties that we currently have between Europe and the United States. But I think it's very important always to see that in the context that I really don't believe any two continents in the world share the same degree of connectivity as Europe and the United States. Maybe the exception would be Australia, New Zealand, but on a different scale, let's be frank. This country was created by a European diaspora, an unprecedented European diaspora, was built for many reasons. I mean, adventure, avarice, escape from poverty, but mostly and most importantly, hope, a sense of being able to build a better future in this new world, leaving behind the constraints and the difficulties of Europe, a Europe struggling to be reborn out of feudalism and absolute monarchy, which was constraining all our development. And the ideas which took root here were European ideas, the ideas of the Enlightenment. Smith and Locke and Edmund Burke. I saw a book of his over in the Art Museum earlier today. These ideas were able to take root here in the United States in ways which took longer in Europe. And you were able here to build a new society, but built on these European ideas. And of course, the great second sentence of the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, was a true Copernican moment of political thought, which really did revolutionize the way the world would develop in the future. I put a footnote, because I cannot help but do so, that we note that many of the people who signed that were also slave owners, and that this was a phrase which was meant that the people who were self-evidently equal were not all of the people, but leaving aside that, the sentiment was what it was, and has inspired political thinkers ever since. And the United States was born, and European relations between the United States and Europe developed over the centuries, not without difficulty. The flow of people continued, the flow of capital and technology, enabling the United States to become the great continent it became, continued. But there was rivalry. There were wars with the UK, wars with Spain, as the new state of the United States sought to assert itself in opposition to some of the colonial tendencies in this part of the world, of the Monroe Doctrine, asserting its own sovereignty over this area. So those tensions were there. And when it came to World War I, the outbreak of World War I, the United States did not wish, following Washington's admonition not to get involved in foreign entanglements, held back from wanting to get involved in what was seen as yet another internal squabble and battle of the Europeans. Eventually, it was understood that America actually had a stake in the outcome of that great struggle, and America intervened. We had the Treaty of Versailles, and we had the great initiative to try to build a better world, and the American initiative to build a League of Nations and to try to have a new construct that would make war less possible, not only in Europe, but more generally. We know the story. That didn't succeed. In fact, America went backwards through a period of isolationism. It was not possible to ratify the League of Nations. We had the Depression, you had Prohibition, and a more inward-looking America. And when the events of the 1930s produced the Second World War, America again was very reluctant to get involved, and notwithstanding efforts to support the Allied cause in Europe, it took finally the attack from Japan and a declaration by Germany of war on the United States for America once again to get involved. The American military intervention was even more decisive in the Second World War than it was in the First, and thank goodness for the second time America was able to help Europe liberate itself from totalitarianism and from Nazism. And we never forget the sacrifice of young American men and women in those two world wars. I've seen some of the names here on buildings in this university. I see it everywhere I go in the United States. And you should understand that this is something which is still deeply felt in Europe and never forgotten. President Juncker, the President of the European Commission, spent a good few minutes talking to President Trump when they met in the White House on the 25th of July last year, explaining that for him, the experience of the American liberation of Luxembourg was something he would never forget. General MacArthur is actually buried in Luxembourg. And the care which is given to the graveyards of American soldiers in Europe by Europeans, by villagers, by people still remembering what those people did is something which is deeply felt, and I want to acknowledge that here today and to say that that is an enduring legacy of friendship between us that is never forgotten. But more importantly, after the Second World War, enlightened American statesmen and women decided that this time they would also, having helped us win the war, they would try to help us win the peace. And there was a radically different approach taken after the Second World War than had been taken after the First World War, with the Treaty of Versailles in particular, which was a punitive and vindictive treaty which ultimately laid the seeds of a second war. And on this occasion, it was decided to make friends of former enemies. What the United States did in Germany and in Japan, and I spent 4 years living in Japan in the early 80s, was quite remarkable. The incredible foresight and statesmanship that went into actually helping those two countries reinvent themselves as democracies and as peace-loving countries, having come back from the history of Nazism in the case of Germany, or of the militaristic state that was Japan in the 1930s. And this heralded an unprecedented period in world history from 1945 through pretty much to the end of the last century, which we can call a Pax Americana. It was also built by the institutions which America helped to build much more successfully this time than with the League of Nations. So we had the successful creation of the United Nations, of NATO, of the Bretton Woods Institution, the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT, the GATT, the World Trade Organization as we now know it. This tissue of multilateral structures helped generate a period of peace and stability unprecedented in world history. And this was very much due to American leadership. And the collapse of communism in 1990, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union was in some ways, and many ways, seen as a vindication of that period and of those policies and the Great Enlightenment. And I think we can all remember the huge optimism that was felt at that moment across the world, that we really had entered a new era. Francis Fukuyama said it was the end of history. Well, that was a bit of hubris, I fear. I'm sure he would like to take a different title for that book now in retrospect. But still, it was a moment of great optimism. And in Europe, in parallel, with the American initiative of rebuilding, we also decided, after 2 world wars and the Holocaust, that we needed a different business model for managing our continent. And under the impulse of the Marshall Plan, which was, of course, very grateful financial assistance to Europe to help rebuild, but it also came with the exhortation, and indeed in some cases the condition, that we work together, that we build new pan-European structures of cooperation in order to try to avoid repeating the errors of the previous 50 years. The Marshall Plan begat the European Coal and Steel Community, which begat the European Economic Community, which begat what we now know as the European Union. And this was also on the European continent a period of unprecedented progress. The European Union delivered peace, freedom, and prosperity since its creation in the early 50s to the present day. Peace, it's self-evident, 70 years of without major power conflict on the European continent. You have to go back a very, very long time in our history to find a comparable period. It wasn't exclusively due to the European Union. Of course, it was due to NATO. It was due also, at least in the early stages, to some of the Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. But fundamentally, it enabled the reconciliation of France and Germany, which had been the single greatest source of instability in European politics and society since the late 19th century. Freedom, it was founded on the principles of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, freedom of expression, and the market economy. It was a beacon for countries emerging from totalitarianism. The first was Greece in 1981 after the collapse of the colonel's regime, put in place with American assistance, but we pass on that. The first thing that a democratic Greece wanted to do was join the European Union. The same was true for Spain and Portugal in 1985 with the collapse of the death of Franco and the collapse of Salazar. Both countries saw entering the European Union as the consolidation of their commitment to democracy and the rule of law, and you look at the progress those countries have made since then, it is quite remarkable. The same was true, of course, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the manner in which the newly emerging countries of Central Europe rushed to join the European Union. I don't believe that the European Union can claim credit for the collapse of the Berlin Wall, but I do believe that the European Union can claim credit for the fact that that collapse was not followed by chaos and fighting and discord, but rather the orderly transition of countries formerly part of totalitarian communism into, broadly speaking, Western-oriented liberal democracies. I'll come back to some of the challenges that we now face on that issue, but I can tell you that in 2004, the moment when those 10 countries joined the European Union, the event took place in Dublin because it was the Irish presidency of the European Union in the home of the Irish president, the OSullivan. It was, for me personally, a moment of enormous pride to see an independent Ireland welcoming and hosting the event where the 10 countries of the former Soviet bloc joined the European Union, and as the flags in Notre of the 10 countries were raised in a solemn ceremony by the Irish Defence Forces, it really, really seemed like a moment of huge optimism. And to think that all the progress that had been made and the future which lay ahead, certainly with challenges, but with enormous optimism. Finally, prosperity. You may laugh because the European Union has had, when the European Union got the Nobel Peace Prize back in 2011, I think, I might be wrong, I would happen to be in New York and I had to make a speech at an event attended by Ban Ki-moon, and I said that I was delighted that we had won the Nobel Peace Prize. That was, of course, at the height of the euro crisis. I said, because clearly we were not going to win the Nobel Prize for economics, which the Secretary General seemed to think was very funny. He kept chuckling as he was leaving, saying, that's a great joke, great joke. I would actually respectfully say that the European Union could also get the Nobel Prize for economics, because we have built out of 28 separate countries the largest single market in the world, 500 million people. You often forget this in the United States because you never aggregate our economic statistics. you always compare yourselves to Germany or you compare yourselves to France. I mean, it's a no-brainer for you. I understand why you do it, because you always look so much better. Compare yourselves to the European Union, and actually, we are the three largest economies in the world: the European Union, the United States, and China. When I first arrived, the exchange rates were such, as ambassador, we were actually first, the largest economy in the world, and I used to be able to say that China and America were battling for second and third place. This did not always go down very well in Washington. I have to admit that the exchange rate thing has moved around a bit, and now it fluctuates. But to be frank, those are the three largest economic entities in the world by far. And the European Union is the largest trading bloc in the world, the largest donor of development assistance, the largest donor of humanitarian assistance. And this is something which we have created consensually and democratically through the approval of our member states. And it is a remarkable achievement. And we have done this in full respect of the identity and the cultural separateness of our member states. We are not building a monolithic United States of Europe which seeks to eliminate national differences. On the contrary, our member states are deeply attached to their national identity, to their language, to their culture, to their cuisine. When you go to Estonia, believe me, you know you're in Estonia, not in Greece. And when you're in Portugal, you don't think you're in Poland. And that's ever how it's going to be. We don't wish to create homogenized European identity. We combine the two levels of identity, a national identity and a European identity. For me, those of you know Ireland well, many of you, at least in this place, at least here in America, in this part of America, I know people know Ireland well. You will know that the Irish people, their first reaction is not whether you're Irish, it's where are you from in Ireland, right? What county are you from? Now, I'm from Dublin, as is Declan. And we can agree, I've no doubt, that Dublin's the best place in Ireland, let's be frank. I mean, there are other nice places, but Dublin is where it really counts. So I'm Dublin, I'm Irish, I'm European. There's no contradiction between these levels of identity. They are complementary. And that is very important to understand, and it is very important. Ireland has never had a higher international profile than since it joined the European Union. Ireland has a greater, its cultural activity, its economic activity, it's much higher now than it was when we were not part of the European Union, but still independent. And that is, so what the European Union is doing in creating, in an unprecedented way, a supranational grouping of sovereign states who willingly and with democratic control pool sovereignty because you can get better outcomes from your people by doing certain things together than if you do it separately. This is also a Copernican moment in political thought. It's never been done before in the history of the world. And it is a remarkable achievement. And I think we are very grateful for the fact that we've been able to do that with a huge amount of support from the United States. Now, that takes me in my sort of, Cook's tour of the history of the world, to the fact that all of this seemed hugely optimistic at the turn of the century. You then had 9/11, which we've just commemorated yet again, which was a horrible moment and a kind of wake-up call, and I think it had a very dramatic impact on a loss of innocence of this country, which resulted in the invasion of Afghanistan. I remind people, because I think it's important to do so, that the only time Article 5 of the NATO treaty has ever been invoked is when the other member states of NATO spontaneously, and not at the request of the United States, declared in the aftermath of 9/11 that the attack on the United States was an attack on every NATO member, and all the countries of NATO mobilized to support the United States. NATO also followed the United States into Afghanistan, which I can assure you was not a self-evident decision. And over 1,000 European NATO members have died in that war in Afghanistan, alongside American troops. So I think that there was a strong degree of solidarity with the United States in face of that attack. This was then followed, unfortunately, by a war which divided us, which was the invasion of Iraq. Personally, sorry if you disagree, a catastrophic decision with catastrophic consequences, which we are still living with today. It divided us because most European countries did not agree that this was the right thing to do. I understand from an American perspective, why some people thought it was, but it had enormous consequences. And in Europe, we had the 2008 financial crisis, which brought a massive change in the mood and in the economic situation. I once heard Tony Blair say that he thought 9/11 should be considered the true beginning of the new millennium. Respectfully, I don't quite agree. I think it maybe gets second place for that title. The real title, in my view, belongs on the 15th of September 2008 and the collapse of Lehman Brothers. The collapse of Lehman Brothers and the financial crisis which followed was an absolute tectonic shifting moment for the Western world in particular, because it exploded our confidence in our financial institutions, in our political institutions, and in economic policy. And we have still not fully recovered from the consequences of that moment. We have managed to correct some of the worst moments of the economic side of things, but as I will explain in a few minutes, I think we still are living with the fallout from that, and many of the political problems we face on both sides of the Atlantic still have their origins in that catastrophic moment and what it revealed about what was not working in our economic model. For the European Union, there then followed some very, very difficult years. The financial crisis turned into a fiscal crisis. We had the bailouts in Ireland, in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal. We had the sense that the euro was going to collapse. I must say, overhyped, in my view, by a lot of the British and American press. I remember the amount of times I spent telling people the euro is not going to collapse. I don't know, you don't know what you're talking about, it's going to collapse. It did not collapse, but it is true that the system was put under huge strain because we realized that there were flaws in the way in which the European Monetary Union had been constructed. There was a need for radical new steps to protect and to build a better architecture, which we have to a large extent succeeded in doing, but not completely. We had Russian aggression in Georgia in 2008, which kind of went unnoticed, but then, of course, in Crimea in 2014, the annexation of Crimea, and then the persistent Russian interference in the eastern provinces of Ukraine, which was a significant escalation in Putin's disagreement with the West. We had the migration crisis. I don't like to call it a crisis because, to be quite frank, the numbers of people, including the 1 million people taken into Germany, are not a crisis if we had been dealing with it on a continental scale. We are a continent of 500 million people. To say that we couldn't manage a migration flow of 1 or 2 million people is a scandal. But the fact is, we were not managing it on a continental scale. It was managed at the national level. And this gave rise to a massive crisis, particularly on the frontline countries, the countries who were most immediately affected, whether that was when people were coming through the Balkan route, or whether it was when they were coming through the Mediterranean route, or the Eastern Mediterranean, or the Western Mediterranean. We have managed, I think, to address this issue, but it's one which is not going to go away, and we will have to come back to it. We also had significant incidents of terrorism, and people started to conflate the two, even though they were not related. And it's very important to constantly repeat that they were not related. And we had the rise of populism in many European countries, and ultimately Brexit in the United Kingdom. These were all a new challenge for the European Union, and we've been dealing with these difficulties. And Bill was kind enough to say that Europe is in turmoil. I can honestly say to you, and I used to try and say this when I was ambassador, it doesn't actually feel like that when you're in Europe. Yes, we have problems. Yes, we have some challenges, but actually life goes on pretty normally and people are still living pretty well. We have pretty good healthcare, education systems, social welfare systems. The economy is doing reasonably well. But I'm not saying we don't have challenges, but it doesn't actually feel like the place is falling apart in the slightest. The impression sometimes gained on this side of the Atlantic is, in my view, a little too negative. On the other hand, I think here in the United States, you also had some challenges. I remember in April 2016 being at a dinner party in the French embassy in Washington, and people were discussing Europe and the crisis and populism. And I said, well, don't you think you've got a few problems here in Europe? You've got this guy, Mr. Trump. He goes, oh, no. No, there's no comparison between what's going on in Europe and what could happen in the United States. You'll allow me to fast forward a few years and say, well, actually, I think, we've got problems on both sides of the Atlantic. And it is clear, I'm not going to enter into the domestic politics of the new administration, but the arrival of President Trump from a European perspective has produced a massive crisis in relations between the United States and Europe. I can touch on the main issues. You know them well. The withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement was deeply felt as a betrayal by many Europeans, because this is a subject of enormous importance in Europe. This is a hugely important issue, ladies and gentlemen. It always seems perhaps like it's one of those issues, climate change, yeah, but it has been identified by the American military as the single greatest threat to US security over many years now. I think the Trump administration managed to slightly change that, but that is fundamentally that the implications, the security and the economic implications of climate change are massive. Climate change migration, climate change poverty, climate change conflict over scarce resources, water, desertification. Climate change has the potential dramatically to change the way in which this planet functions, not just ecologically and not just in terms of changing weather patterns, but actual conflict and warfare. And we really have to come to grips with this issue. The Paris Agreement was not perfect, but it was the first time we got every country in the world to sit down and acknowledge we have a problem, we have a sort of a plan about how we're going to face it together. Many disagreements, many flaws in that. Will that be enough to stop the temperature rising by more than 2%? Probably not what was agreed in Paris, but it gave us a platform. The withdrawal of the United States is obviously a major blow to that. Now, on this issue, I'm relatively optimistic, because when I used to travel as ambassador across the United States, I found America Inc. actually bought into this climate change agenda. And to me, the business, the recognition by business is pretty irreversible that this is something that we have to do. And the business model of a post-carbon economy is something that most modern businesses actually understand is where we're going. So I'm relatively confident that what is going to be done here at the company level, at the state level, find a lot of interesting stuff going on at the level of governors, mayors in cities. So I think, notwithstanding what the federal administration is doing at other levels of US government, there's a huge recognition about this, and we can cooperate closely. But obviously having the federal administration pushing in the opposite direction is not helpful. Of course, President Trump has made a big issue about burden sharing in defense and security, and this is not a new point. President Obama has said it, other presidents. Robert Gates, who was President Obama's defense secretary, made a very important speech in Brussels in December of 2011. I remember well, I was there, where he warned the Europeans that if we did not do more on our own security, this would become a political issue in the US. So we get that, and it has to be done. I would just like to make a couple of points, if I may, so that you get the context. The first is, it is not true that we're not paying up to NATO. All the member states of NATO have paid the NATO budget. The NATO budget is largely an administrative and small operational budget, but everyone has paid their NATO share. The issue is whether we are spending as much collectively on defense as is the United States, and clearly we are not. The United States currently spends about 4 to 5% of GDP on defense budget. The President would like to spend more. In Europe, the maximum is 1 or 2 member states are meeting a target of 2% set by an agreement in NATO. Most are below that. Why is this? You need to understand that in Europe, traditionally, we needed armies to fight each other. That's why we had armies, because we wanted to fight our neighbors. When we actually decided to stop fighting each other, a lot of people said, well, actually, we don't need as big an army. And so isn't it natural that we actually started spending less on money and more on other things, less on defense and more on other things? And that's why it's not particularly electorally very popular in Europe to say, I want to spend more money on guns and troops. People say, well, why? What are we trying to do? Now, that has changed since the Russian aggression, and I think people are rethinking it, but it's very important that you understand this mindset. Secondly, it's not that we don't spend money on defense. If you add up, going back to my point about aggregating European budgets, if you add up the defense expenditure of all 28 of our member states, it is the second largest defense budget in the world, way ahead of China, way ahead of Russia. Now, the problem is, it's not a very effective defense budget because it's split between 28 countries with high overheads, and we have 1.4 million people in Europe in uniform, in our armed forces. By the way, that's a very big number of people. But we are told by the experts that on a good day, we can maybe put 50,000 fully equipped and trained infantry soldiers in the field. Now, the ratio of that number to the 1.4 million is utterly out of proportion to in the United States, where the ratio is closer to 50%. We get, on average, 15% operational value out of our defense expenditure compared to 50% in the United States. So we have a major problem, which we have to fix, which is the effectiveness and the efficiency of our military operation. But it's not absolutely about spending more money, it's about spending it more wisely, pooling and sharing. We have multiple defense systems, weapons systems, we have overlapping systems and weapons. This all needs to be rationalized. The minute we start doing this, oddly enough, people in Washington start saying, no, that's not what we meant, actually. What we meant is, could you just buy more American equipment? Thank you very much, that'll be fine. There's no reason why we shouldn't also buy some additional American equipment, but you understand this is not necessarily a popular agenda in domestic terms. The final point I want to make about security is the point I made earlier. Europe is a massive spender on overseas development assistance and on humanitarian aid. 60% of overseas development assistance from the developed to the developing world comes from Europe, comes from the European Union and its member states. The figure for humanitarian aid is even higher. That is a massive contribution to global security. And that is something which a share that we bear and a burden that we bear financially, which is not borne by the United States because you're spending money on defense, which I understand. We are also, in trade terms, the only major trading bloc that offers full quota-free, tariff-free access to all exports from the least developed countries to the European market. The only other country that does that is Canada and I believe Australia. But we're the only major trading bloc that does that. Another major contribution to the development of these countries. So this also needs to be put in the equation. None of this is to run away from our responsibility to do more. We need to do it. The idea is not to create a European army. If anyone wants to ask that question later, we can talk about that. It is about creating a more effective European capability, which by definition is also a more effective contribution to NATO. This is not in competition with NATO, because for the vast majority of our member states, NATO is the cornerstone of European security policy. Not for the Irish, we're neutral. A famous Irish Prime Minister said, Charles Haughey said, we're neutral, we just haven't decided who we're neutral against. And unfortunately, we still haven't decided who we're neutral against. So for the time being, Irish participation in all of this is limited. But for the fact remains that for the vast majority of our member states who are part of NATO, NATO is the cornerstone of security, and the transatlantic alliance is key to that. The more worrying aspect of disagreement with this administration is really, I think, actually about multilateralism and about the nature of the European Union itself. This administration has consciously chosen to set itself against multilateralism, against international organizations. It's very strange for many of us because most of these international organizations, as I said before, were created in America's image, have been hugely beneficial to America. It is strange that America now seems to want to go back to an international environment where we don't have rules, where we don't have engagement, and to what we would call the law of the jungle. Maybe the assumption is that because America is the world's greatest superpower, that you will always win in that situation. Time will tell, but I'm not so sure. And more importantly, in Europe, I find it incredible that this administration is encouraging far-right nationalist forces, populist forces, the kind of people who in the 30s gave us the Second World War, gave us the Holocaust. I find it absolutely unbelievable that an American administration would throw its weight behind these kind of forces in Europe and somehow say that they represent nationalism and sovereignty and this is the right way forward. Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, we do not need more nationalism in Europe. We have buckets of nationalism. We're trying to store it like carbon capture. We're trying to sort of harness it and stick it in the ground and kind of say it's there, but we don't need any more of it. What we need is a greater understanding of how we work together, how we cooperate, and how we overcome differences of nationalism and national identity, national language. We don't need more conflicts, and we don't need, with respectfully, someone coming from the outside and basically saying the same thing as Mr. Putin is saying from the other side. You need more nationalism. You should each put your own country first. The whole point about the European Union is that we don't try to put our own country first. We try to sit down and figure out what's collectively in our best interest. And that will usually also be to the benefit of our own countries. Otherwise it wouldn't work. But sometimes you have to make compromises in order to make it work. And I really think this is a fundamental disagreement, which frankly we're going to have to find a way out of this in due course. So I'm coming to the end now. What happens next? Well, the great journalistic question. I have a few journalist friends, and they say, when you don't know what to say at the end of towards the end of an interview, you ask the person, so what happens next, right? So what happens next? Here in America, you have your election next year. And I think most of us are of the view that there's not a lot going to happen until you have your election, because you're basically now in election mode. I don't know who's going to win the election. What I do believe, from the point of view of the rest of us, is that it's very important, and the message I bring back to Europe is this is not only about Mr. Trump. He, of course, is an important personality in the process, but he is much more the symptom than he is the cause of what is happening. And it would be a mistake on our side, respectfully, you're Americans, you may think differently about this, but respectfully, I say it would be a mistake to believe that if President Trump were to lose the election and be replaced by somebody else, a Republican or a Democrat, that we could go back to normal. There are forces at work in your society which are changing the way you think about international relations, and that's reflected in a lot of what President Trump is saying. And I believe the next administration, whether it's Republican, whether it's Democrat, it's going to have to take into account the kind of genie that's been let out of the bottle by this administration. And we in Europe are going to have to acknowledge that we're going to be dealing with a different America. I still believe profoundly in the decency of the American people, in your commitment and your goodness to want to be a force for good in the world, as somebody said. But you will also put your own self-interest first, and how you define that will be part of the political process of what goes through in the election. Will you have an interventionist foreign policy? Will you have a more isolationist foreign policy? Will you spend more on defense? Will you spend less on defense? How will you resolve your internal differences over healthcare, over race, over gun control? All of these issues are going to preoccupy you for many years to come. And we in the rest of the world are going to have to recognize we're going to be dealing with a slightly different America. It's the America you will choose to build, and we will have to deal with it. On the European side, we have new institutions every 5 years, so we've just had the elections to the European Parliament. The good news is there was not the great populist victory that many people predicted. People predicted a great wave of nationalist and populism. It didn't happen. The populist non-establishment vote went up slightly, but still is in a minority in the European Parliament. The centre has broadly held, but the centre looks different than it did before, because whereas previously it was largely composed of two groups, the Christian Democrats on the one hand and the Socialists on the other, they now share much more evenly the power also with groups such as the Liberals and, interestingly, the Greens, who have seen a huge surge all across Europe. So these are all pro-European parties, but with different views about how we address the great questions of our time in terms of economics, society, and international relations. The new commission is in the process of being installed. You will see this going on over the next few weeks. I think the agenda which is going to be pursued will broadly be the same that we've seen until now, but there's going to be a lot of emphasis on climate change. This is a big issue, particularly, as you know, with Greta Thunberg and the Extinction Revolution. This is strongly felt across Europe, I can tell you, and this is a very big political issue. Digital issues, migration is going to continue to be a big question. We haven't solved it yet. There are 65 million displaced people in the world, 25 million of them in our immediate region in Europe. They're not going away. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. We have to figure out how to do this. We have to demonstrate that we can manage our external frontiers, but we cannot close our external frontiers. We cannot deny the legitimate expectations of people fleeing conflict and persecution, and we cannot do to them what we did to the Jewish people in the 1930s, which was to refuse asylum, which is why we have an international convention on refugees and asylum. So we have to find a way of squaring that circle. We in Europe, in any event, will need immigrants. We have a declining demography. We need the economic contribution, but we have to find a way of demonstrating to our citizens that we can do this in a managed way, and we also need to work much harder on the issue of integration and finding ways of ensuring that those immigrants who come to live in our countries are integrated and given the opportunities that are needed. We will also have to address the issue of the rule of law in Europe. This is a big issue now, particularly in Poland and Hungary. Big challenge there, and we will have to address the issue of international relations. The United States being the first challenge, relations with the United States, which is so important for us. China, where we actually share a lot in common with the United States, and Russia, and of course Africa. So I haven't talked at all about Brexit. No, I didn't talk about it for two reasons. Firstly, I know you're going to ask me a question, so you're going to give me the opportunity. Secondly, it's very difficult to be concise about Brexit. What can I say? The British have voted that they want to leave. We're very disappointed. You will note that the European Union allows countries to leave. Not something you allow in your own constitution, by the way. I'm sure yours is a very good constitution, but I just note that the undemocratic European Union actually allows countries democratically to vote to leave. But leaving, as Paul Simon says, there are 50 ways to leave your lover. We're discovering there are 50 ways to Brexit, or maybe 100 ways to Brexit. All I can say is, this has largely become a British problem in the sense that they have to figure out what it is they want to do. And frankly, the rest of us are having a hard time fully understanding that. And so I will deal with that in questions. But what I think is important to understand is that whereas some people thought that the British decision to leave would be the beginning of the unraveling of the European Union, it has actually had the opposite effect. Support for membership of the European Union across other member states is at an all-time high, running into the high 80s in many countries. Because precisely watching what is happening in the UK, people are actually leaving the European Union is maybe not such a great idea. Maybe we don't always love it. We don't always think it's the best thing. But frankly, it's clear that when you try to leave, it brings you all kinds of problems that you didn't have to deal with before then. But fundamentally, and this is now my absolute last point I want to make, on both sides of the Atlantic, we are still dealing with the unresolved issues of the financial crisis. We're dealing with the collapse of the center on both sides of the Atlantic. We're dealing with a feeling of inequality, a sense of injustice. If you look at the income inequality in Europe is much better than it is here, but it is still worse today than it was 20 years ago, and this is deeply felt. And we are dealing with identity politics. In Europe, this reflects itself in nationalism, national identity, or subnational, like the Catalonia. Here, it represents itself, frankly, in cleavages between different ethnic groupings within the American society. And this is something which was triggered by the financial crisis, but respectfully is being stoked by certain forces who see a certain interest in encouraging this kind of, blame the immigrants, blame globalization, blame trade. In fact, much of these issues, both in America and in Europe, are the result of domestic policy choices. We can choose to have a more equal society. We can choose to spend more money on social justice or on education or on healthcare. These are not decided by China or by globalization. They're decided by our own politics. And I think we have not yet found the optimum response which squares the circle of economic competitiveness and success with equality, social justice, and a greater sense of inclusiveness, whether it's in your society or in our European societies. And in this, we have the institutions which are strongest to us are very much under threat. The press, the courts, even Parliament. We've seen this in the UK. And this is very dangerous. We are going through, in my view, a profoundly dangerous moment in the Western world in terms of our politics. And we're having this on both sides of the Atlantic. And I hope that we will find each other at the end of this. I'm an unreconstructed believer in the importance of the transatlantic relationship. I don't believe those in Europe who say, oh, this is now the time for Europe to be more autonomous, to be more distant from the US. Yes, we will always need some distance, but we need the relationship. I believe that you need the relationship with Europe. I always used to like to say it's like Ghostbusters, who are you going to call? When we have a problem on either side of the Atlantic, fundamentally we call each other. And I don't think we're going to call Xi Jinping, I don't think we'll call Mr. Putin. So we are condemned to find a way to work closely together. And on this, I would just like to commend the work of the Nanovic Institute of Notre Dame, because ultimately this comes down to people. I referred earlier to the strong sense of connection, and you mentioned it, Bill, between the United States and Europe through people. And this is true historically because so many people came from Europe. But your demography is changing. You have a growth of Asian Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and the people of European origin are a declining proportion of the population. We need to reinvent this relationship for every generation. And we need to explain why African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans have an interest in this relationship, even if their ancestors didn't come from there. It's very easy if your ancestors came from Ireland and you enjoy going backwards and forwards, or from Scotland or from Italy. But the fact is we share values and interests which are not dependent on connections of kith and kin and family, but rather on shared values and a commitment to a vision of the world which is uniquely shared between us and not shared by everybody else in this world, and which is uniquely under threat. So I hope the work that you do here in this institute, and I thank you for it, can be complemented by work done in Europe, working on the same level of sending people to the United States, and that we can find a way to continue the enormous strength of transatlantic bonds which have taken us a long way in the 20th century and can still take us a long way in the 21st. Thank you.
What an intense crash course or master class on, my head's still reeling, on contemporary Europe and the EU. Really wonderful and overwhelming in certain ways. While you're getting your questions ready, and I see one already, I'll just quickly reflect on my divergent experiences of the ambassador. I met him about a year ago, and you were then in office, very much the ambassador, sitting down, and I had a rather different experience. It was much more serene. The answers were insightful, but I would say less full of passion and the candor that we saw tonight. So it's a real treat to have this. At any rate, let's have Adam, the ambassador, said he's more than happy to take lots of questions. To help us get to a lot of people, if you could keep your questions concise and a real question, that would be nice. If you need the microphone, I'm happy to give it to you. Otherwise, stand up and speak it loudly. Do you want the mic?
If you like. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask you to say a few words about a subject you didn't address, but it's timely. The United Nations is meeting. They have the 17 millennial goals, which in my view are struggling compared to the last set of goals in which we made huge progress on poverty and hunger. My sense is that Europe has been much stronger, much more supportive, much more successful in meeting the goals than we have been in the States. And specifically, I'd like to ask you about Africa, because Africa, from what I read, seems to be getting their act together more and having goals for 68 or 2068, I think, whatever it is. But if you'd be willing to say a few words about your perspective on that, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think the Millennium Goals are, if you like, just summing up, or a nice way of kind of creating an inventory of the challenges we face, collectively on the planet and individually as countries. And in that regard, I think they're a useful point of reference. They still require a huge effort on the part of individual countries and on the part of institutions. The lack of support from this administration for that kind of approach is obviously unhelpful. I think the Europeans are fully signed up. We will continue to do that. We are the largest funders of this activity by far, and we will continue to do that. But I think we need America also on board. As I say, I'm relatively optimistic about what is happening in America, but the fact that we don't have an administration that is signed up to that is not helpful. On Africa, Africa for me is the neighborhood of Europe. I mean, if we don't look after Africa, I don't know who will. It's hugely challenging. There's a lot to be optimistic about in Africa. There's a lot of positive, but it's also hugely challenging. And from a European perspective, the work of the African Union, their attempts to unify the continent, to create, they have an ambition of creating a single market for the whole of the African continent, modeled on what we've tried to do. I fear it may be over-ambitious at their level of development, but it's a good objective. And I think we certainly, and I think the next Commission, will be heavily involved in refocusing a lot of our external development assistance on Africa, not least for the selfish reason that it is from Africa that the biggest migration threat is presented for Europe. Of course, instability in the Middle East, if God forbid we have another conflict in the Middle East, we would see an outflow as we had with Syria. But in fact, the long-term serious threat of very worrying migration is from Africa. And to that, we need to do two things. We need to have more clear legal paths of migration, make it relatively easier for people to migrate legally and under decent conditions, while at the same time increasing the investment to create greater conditions of prosperity and hope in their own countries so that people don't feel this pressing need to flee their country. Now, that's easier said than done, but I think that is one of the things the next European Commission is going to put a lot of emphasis on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for this splendid lecture. You were at the end, as Bill was already saying, more honest in pointing to some problems of the European Union. Without any doubt, the European Union is a great success story, but the historical evidence shows that usually cooperations of countries that start as confederacies either evolve towards a form of federal state, like this country did, or they fall apart. There are very, very few confederacies that were at least able to survive historical crises. The last example was the Holy Roman Empire of German nation that was more or less a confederation, but under the big crisis of the French Revolution, it collapsed and fell apart. Do you see any possibility for the European Union to move towards a federal state? Clearly, only France and Germany could be the motors of such a development. If we read the white book of the European Union on 5 scenarios, how the European Union may develop in the next decades, everything is possible. And one has the impression that there is no clearly shared strategy. Where do we want to be as the European Union in the next 20 years?
No, it's a very good question, and as you can imagine, it's one that people in Brussels, ask themselves every morning over breakfast. I would say two things. The first is I don't totally agree with the premise of your question, which is that the historical experience condemns us to assume that either we have a federal state or we fall apart. I do believe it is possible to imagine a new outcome, which is a compromise between the two, where we reconcile the benefits of supranational, of a large degree of supranational action in certain areas while retaining the maximum level of autonomy at the national level for what can best be done. In this august Catholic institution, I'm sure the word subsidiarity is understood, and that is something which I believe we're in the process of doing. I believe it is an absolute mistake to say to the people of Europe, you've got to choose. Either you create a federal Europe, in like the United States, or you are facing catastrophe. People will not make that kind of choice. On the other hand, day by day, I believe that we make those choices. In the face of the migration crisis, we created a European Border and Coast Guard, which now has 10,000 people. If you'd said 2 years before the migration crisis, I'd like to create a European Border and Coast Guard service, everyone would have said, no, what do we need that for? We don't need that. Then the minute the crisis comes, people, oh yeah, okay, you're right, we need that. So I think that is what we are doing. I believe it is unique. Personally, I believe it will succeed. It has risks. It could fall apart, yes, but then anything can fall apart. We're about to see the United Kingdom fall apart, perhaps. But I think it can also survive and thrive. And I don't think that we need, if we constrain our thinking to a binary model of, United States of Europe, a la United States of America, or chaos, then we are we're taking the wrong intellectual starting point for what we're trying to do.
So I too, Ambassador, want to thank you for your forceful words, your outspoken words, especially about global climate change. I want to ask you about Brexit, though. And, specifically, I want to ask you to comment not on what Brexit might mean for the future of Europe, but rather what it might mean for the future of the transatlantic relationship. It seems pretty clear that Boris Johnson thinks that the way out of the economic mess that Great Britain is currently maneuvering itself into is through closer ties to the United States. And it seems also clear that the Trump administration is welcoming Brexit as an opportunity to renegotiate the relationship between America and Europe as a whole. So do you think that in the long run, after Johnson and Trump are gone, whether the U.S.-Great Britain relationship will evolve into a relationship of competition to the one that exists between the European Union and America or not? Is this something of short duration, or are we looking at a fundamental realignment?
Look, I don't know how Brexit is going to end finally, and that's the unanswered question of the British referendum is yes, 17.4 million people voted to leave. The fact is that there are probably 17.4 million versions of what leaving meant. And that is still the case. And Prime Minister Johnson is promoting one particular vision. I don't think it's shared by a majority in the House of Commons. I'm not even sure it's shared by a majority in the British electorate. And probably there's going to be an election, and we will see. So, the jury is completely out on what Brexit looks like in terms of, assuming the UK leaves, and my working assumption is that they will leave. There are many ways in which they can leave. They can leave and cut completely ties with the European Union. They can leave and retain strong ties like Norway or Switzerland with the European Union. But just one simple economic fact. The UK currently exports 12% of its exports go to the US. 46% of its exports go to the EU. It tells you everything you want to know. You think Mr. Trump is going to offer the UK a trade deal that allows them to double their exports to the United States? President Trump, the UK has a huge surplus. In President Trump's mind, the negotiation of a trade deal is by how much they reduce their trade surplus in trading with the UK, not by how much they increase it. So, in trade, geography is destiny. Everyone trades most with their closest partners. And that, in my view, is a reality that the UK is going to have to deal with. Of course, the UK has close relations with the United States. Of course, they will continue, and maybe they can develop even closer relations. But you do not bridge a gap between 12% of your exports going to the US and 46% going to the EU by a trade deal. And that, in my view, is an economic reality. I think the more important question is not economic. The more important question is policy and politics, and for the moment the United Kingdom has remained very closely aligned with the European view, the predominant European view on climate change, on Iran, on the Middle East, on China, even on Huawei. Is that going to change? And that will create a much greater situation of tension if there were to be a major divergence with the UK on those issues. And so I think the economic issue, I'm sure the UK will want to have strong ties with the United States, but I don't believe it's going to displace in any way their strong economic dependence on strong links with the rest of Europe.
Mr. Professor, what is the most likely outcome of Brexit for Ireland?
Well, there's no good outcome for Ireland from Brexit. Brexit is the worst thing that could have happened to Ireland from the point of view of Northern Ireland, because the entire success of the Good Friday Agreement was predicated on joint membership of the European Union. Someday, somebody, maybe a student here, will write a thesis about the contribution of the European Union to the peace process in Northern Ireland, which is multifaceted. One of it was the enormous contacts it promoted between British and Irish ministers on a regular basis attending meetings in Brussels, which actually became a kind of back channel for discussions which then helped underpin the diplomatic process which helped spawn the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement, the primary credit goes to the people of Northern Ireland, who decided themselves on both sides of the divide that they wanted a better future. It goes to the British government, the Irish government, and to the American government for the support they gave to that process. But it also goes to the fact that the European Union, joint membership of the European Union, is what enabled people to square the circle of the Good Friday Agreement, which is what? The recognition that Northern Ireland will remain an integral part of the United Kingdom until such time as a majority in Northern Ireland decide otherwise. That was a Copernican revolution in the way in which the Northern Ireland issue was approached in the south of Ireland, or for the nationalists in north of Ireland. The other side of that coin was a recognition that since we were both in the European Union, and once you took down the security apparatus at the border, you had no need for any other checks at the border. In practice, it was as though you were living on a united Ireland. I remember, Declan, when we used to go debating up to Queen's, and we used to get on the train and you were stopped and the army came on, and when you got off the train you went through army checkpoints and you went through gates in Belfast checking you for bombs and all of that. All of that is gone. You now drive across the border. You can live in the south, work in the north, live in the north, work in the south. You cross the border 10 times as you find your way along. The only thing that tells you crossed the border is a ping on your iPhone saying you've changed service provider. In all other respects, the border has disappeared. It used to be that you had red telephone boxes on the north side and green telephone boxes on the south side. There are no telephone boxes anywhere anymore, so you don't notice. And that was what transformed the situation. And the poison of Brexit is you now bring back a debate about how you police the border. Not police it in security terms, but how you if you've got two completely different trade regimes on either side of the border, what do you do? The other thing it has done, unfortunately, it has poisoned Anglo-Irish relations. I remember the visit of the Queen in 2011. I honestly never thought I would see in my lifetime the Queen of England applauded on the streets of Dublin and Cork. I really never thought that would be imaginable, and yet it happened. And in 2011, you could have drawn a sigh of relief. My God, we've put all that behind us. We've matured. We can have decent neighbourly relations with the UK, which is a country with whom we share so much, culturally and family-wise and everything else. And we can put behind us the horrors of, 700 years, 800 years of oppression, plus the bombings on the British mainland by the IRA. All of that forgotten. And now you go on Twitter. Honestly, it's like we've gone back to the 1990s, the 1980s. British people saying the Irish have got too big for their boots, Irish people saying, oh, the British could never be trusted. There has been a massive deterioration in the quality of the engagement between the UK and Ireland, not necessarily at the level of senior politicians, but on a kind of popular thing. So it's been very bad news for Ireland. What can we do? I don't know. We have to wait and see what is decided. I think Ireland remains determined to avoid an outcome which requires us to put back a hard border on the island of Ireland. But let's be honest, if the British go for a no-deal Brexit, if they go for leaving the European Union with no deal, then unfortunately there will have to be a hard border in some form or other instituted, because the border between the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland becomes the border between the United Kingdom and the European Union. And that's not a small matter in terms of trade flows, in terms of the possibility of organized crime, smuggling. You're going to have all kinds of illegal organizations, not just the Irish illegal organizations, the IRA coming back or whatever. You're going to have the Chechen mafia, the Russian mafia. People are going to see money to be made if you don't police that border. And when the British say they don't intend to put checks on the border, it's an act of utter irresponsibility, and they will do it, by the way. They're just, it's a matter of public order. There will unfortunately have to be checks at the border. And then, what happens then, I don't know. So, I mean, I think the discussions around the backstop and trying to find a solution mutually agreeable that enables us to avoid that is hugely important. But Brexit is not good news for Ireland.
If any of you think that Brexit and the future of Ireland is a topic worthy of an entire panel, you're right, and we are sponsoring it in our Keough offices in Washington, D.C. on October 24th. It won't help those of you in South Bend, but it will actually, because we're going to live stream it. So stay tuned for that. There's obviously much more to be said on this. I guess I'd also want to, I don't know if it's a plug, but a remark, since my boss is sitting in the second row here. David, you mentioned at least three things that I stick in my mind. There are probably many more, but the fact that the EU and Europe itself is by far the largest grantor of humanitarian and development aid. The fact that there are 25 million people displaced currently in Europe or on the way. The fact that Europe has a special relationship referred to Africa as its backyard. All these things, I think, make it clear how important European Studies is to IHD, to our mission in the Keough School of Global Affairs. We are at the dead center of what it's all about. We may have time for one more question, and then we will do the ceremony.
I never thought I would see the end of the Soviet Union in my lifetime. So I hope you don't think this question is preposterous. But if Russia ever came to be capable of joining the EU, would that be a good thing?
Well, the idea that Russia would join the European Union, I think is based on what we used to call the theory of propinquity, which is that every time the European Union expands, the country which finds itself on the frontier becomes a candidate for membership. So, yes, we now have a frontier with Russia, so why shouldn't they join? You do realize that the next country with a frontier after Russia joins is Alaska. So you've exposed the European Union's theory of global dominance and world supremacy and world government that we were trying to keep secret. Actually, no, I genuinely think that one of the debates we're going to have in Europe are the limits of European integration. And I think we're getting pretty close to those limits. I don't believe we can endlessly expand. The next enlargement, in my view, will be the Western Balkans, because we do understand that the nature of the Western Balkans is such that without being members of the European Union, those countries have no future. Their joining the European Union poses a large number of problems because they are very small and they're quite numerous, and so it's going to complicate our institutional structures. Most importantly, we're only going to let them in when they've resolved all of their regional tensions. We're not going to import those problems inside the European Union. So that's going to take a while, but the commitment is there. Beyond that, I personally believe that the decision to open negotiations on membership with Turkey was a huge mistake. Turkey, in my view, Turkey never wanted to join the European Union. Turkey always wanted the European Union to join Turkey. Turkey is too big. It's got nothing to do with the fact that they're Muslim, by the way. I mean, some people may worry about that. They're 80 million people. They would have more members of the European Parliament than the Germans would. Singly, Turkey would absorb the entire budget for regional, social, and agricultural funding across the European Union. Just on its own, it would suck all of that money in immediately. It's just unsustainable. It's not politically possible. So what we need to find are different ways of working with our neighbors short of full membership. And that would ultimately include Russia because, of course, Russia under Putin is probably a very difficult interlocutor, but Russia is our single most important neighbor on the European continent. We have deep ties with the Russian people. We need a better relationship with Russia because it's an important part of the European continent. We just have to figure out how to do that, and I fear that as long as Mr. Putin is there, it's going to be very difficult. The only thing that worries me is whoever follows Mr. Putin could actually be worse rather than better.
One last short question.
What does the Union need to do to address the challenge posed by Hungary and, to a lesser extent, Poland's abandonment of liberal democratic institutions?
This is a very, I was hoping no one would ask me this question. I think there's a difference between Hungary and Poland, because in Poland there is still an opposition, there's still a civil society, and the tendency which is there, which is real, and the challenges which the European Union has put, particularly about the control of the judiciary, are important. Hungary is much more worrying because the process is almost complete. I mean, Mr. Orban has basically created a situation of dictatorial democracy, if you like, or Putin-like managed democracy. How you undo that is very, very difficult. But I think it's a fundamental challenge for us. And as you can imagine, it goes to the core. We never imagined, ladies and gentlemen, in 2000, I was heavily involved in the negotiation for the 10 countries of Central Europe when they joined in 2004, and we thought it was a great achievement. We genuinely never imagined that it could go backwards. And there is a provision in the treaty, Article 7, which allows sanctions against a country which is deemed to be in breach of fundamental rights. So it's not that we completely ignored the problem, we did. The flaw in it is it can only be triggered by unanimity of all the countries except the country who's in the dock. And for the moment, Poland and Hungary are mutually supporting each other in having a veto on that. This is absolutely fundamental. If we are not a European Union of values and commitment to the rule of law, to democracy, to freedom of expression, then we are nothing. And this is going to be a very difficult discussion. And personally, I'm very disappointed that the European People's Party, the centre-right grouping, bringing together all the centre-right parties, have been so lax in continuing to allow the Fidesz party of Mr. Orban to be a member of that grouping. Their membership is suspended, but in practice they're still participating. I think we need to send a much stronger signal of disapproval, and we need to start looking very seriously, and I think that will happen, at withdrawing the financial support of the European Union for a country which is not respecting our fundamental values. Hungary is in receipt of massive sums of European Union transfers, and I think we seriously have to consider stopping that until such time as Hungary comes into greater conformity of the process. The difficulty, and I'll stop there, Bill, the difficulty you can understand is making this not an arbitrary political process. It has to be a legally based process, because if it's just political, then the people of Hungary, even the people of Hungary who don't like Mr. Orban, will think they're being victimized and it's everyone gang up, and it's very easy to produce a nationalist reflex. So it has to be based in detail, in explaining which law is in contravention of which rule in the European Union, and that's where the European Court of Justice has been very strong in finding against Poland, and in fairness, the Poles have respected that. They have stopped short of being willing to not respect a judgment of the European Court. We're not yet in that situation with Hungary, and we need to create that legal environment in which we can then also give some financial teeth to the consequences you draw for a breach of our legal order.
I didn't mean to rush you because every sentence is valuable.
Before we move to our final ritual, is there a question from a student? I didn't pause at the beginning, as I should have, to particularly invite a student to ask a question. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I want to give you the opportunity.
They won't be graded, right?
No. There is indeed. Oh, excellent. Let me give you the microphone.
Thank you very much for speaking to us today. During your lecture, you talked about the influence of the United States and Russia in supporting the rise of right-wing or nationalist parties in much of Europe. I just want to know if you could speak a little more about what influence outside powers such as the United States or Russia have had on their rise and any influence they've had on their activities or ability to succeed.
Well, I mean, I think it's well known that Russia has been very supportive of a number of right-wing and populist nationalist movements. Mr. Salvini is regularly in Moscow. Recently was seen discussing money. A number of similar parties in Central and Eastern Europe. Mr. Orban also has strong ties to Russia. So I mean, I think the Russian influence is well known. I'm not going to say that it's determining. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I don't think they are. I wouldn't say that if you didn't have Russia, you wouldn't have the problem. I mean, the problem is intrinsic, and we have to deal with it. These are parties which find support. On the American side, there has been for a number of years very strong support from, particularly on the Republican side. The Heritage Foundation, for example, works strongly with a number of these parties, and current American ambassadors in Europe actively work and talk to and encourage these groups, whether it's Mr. Wilders in the Netherlands, whether it's Le Pen in France, AFD in Germany, and frankly, you just have to look at the Twitter feeds of some of these ambassadors. They're fairly openly, and Steve Bannon, of course, we know, good Irish Catholic that he is a leading exponent of nationalism versus the European Union, and sees the European Union as something which has to be broken down. By the way, John Bolton, who has now left the administration, but believes the same thing and has been giving active support. And of course, President Trump himself gives a lot of support to nationalist and far-right movements in Europe, has spoken out very strongly in support of Brexit very recently. Nothing wrong with speaking out in support of Brexit if that's what you really believe, but I mean, I think that when you connect the dots across the various connections which are there, it is very clear that there is a structured attempt to encourage the development of those forces in Europe who are antipathetic to European integration, to multilateralism, and to international law-based organizations in favor of a more narrow nationalist agenda. By the way, from Mr. Trump's point of view and from the administration's point of view, entirely self-interested. As President Trump has seen, when Europe is united, as we are on trade, we're a much more difficult animal to deal with than when we are divided and you can deal with individual countries. So I understand why, on one level, why people would prefer that. On the other level, I think there's an element of sorcerer's apprentice in all of this. People do not know what they are meddling with. And those of us who are European and know where this has led us in the past, and know that you don't have to scrape too far below the surface of most Europeans where you can bring out some of this atavistic nationalist stuff, this is a very dangerous game to be playing. And we know how this movie ends, and it is not entirely excluded that it could end the same way again. I think we've come a long way. I think it's highly unlikely, but a very dangerous game is being played. I used to jokingly say to friends in Washington, you want the Germans to be more nationalistic and to spend more money on armaments. You want the Japanese to be more nationalistic and spend more money on armaments. Where did I last hear that, and how did it end last time? I'm joking, but I'm also serious. Those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it.
That's a great way to end. Just one more minute of your time, please. we have a ritual. We have a little present, a gift for the ambassador. I can't take responsibility for it. It was actually organized by a wonderful new colleague, Grant Osborne, so I asked him to come up and explain it. But let me set it up for just a second. Earlier this afternoon, as I think you heard at the very beginning of the talk, Ambassador OSullivan took a tour of the Snipe Museum, and in particular of a collection of Irish paintings. And so we had the temerity to have one of these reproduced. It's very Swansea's. I'm looking at my cheat sheet. Young Claudius from 1942. Oh, wow. So we admire it. Grant, can you say a few words about it?
Absolutely. So this work of art, painting Young Claudius, was created during the Second World War by Mary Swansea on returning to Dublin, Ireland, in order to escape the air raids in London. As the historical roots of the European Union lie in the same conflict and hope for peace and cooperation, we hope that you view this work as a reminder of your contributions as a civil servant and of your time at Notre Dame.